Most people who know the name Winston Churchill know the image, the cigar, the voice on the radio, the defiant posture that kept a nation from losing its nerve. What far fewer people know is what was happening a few feet behind that image, in the quieter rooms, in the silences between the speeches. Clementine Churchill spent 56 years beside one of the most demanding human beings of the 20th century. She did most of it without complaint. She did some of it in private breakdown, and she did all of it in the shadow of a legend that was too bright for anyone standing directly beside it to be clearly seen. This is her story. Part 1. A childhood built on uncertainty. Clementine Ogilvy Hosier was born on April 1st, 1885, in a London townhouse on Grosvenor Street, Mayfair. On paper, the circumstances looked respectable. Her mother, Lady Blanche Hosier, was the daughter of the 10th Earl of Airlie. Her legal father, Colonel Sir Henry Montague Hosier, came from a family of standing. Aristocratic blood ran on both sides. The world Clementine entered was supposed to be one of stability and social comfort. It was none of those things. Lady Blanche Hosier and her husband were, by every account of people who knew them, deeply incompatible in ways that both of them dealt with through serial infidelity. Henry Hosier was cold, autocratic, and had reportedly expressed strong reservations about fathering children. Lady Blanche, for her part, was known across the social circles they inhabited for an open disregard for conventional fidelity. The speculation that surrounded the family, and which historians have debated at length ever since, was that none of Lady Blanche's 4 children, including Clementine, were actually fathered by Henry. The man most historians now consider the most probable biological father is Bertram Freeman Mitford, 1st Baron Redesdale, who happened to be the husband of Lady Blanche's own sister. Clementine grew up never knowing with certainty where she came from. The marriage between Henry and Blanche collapsed formally when Clementine was 6 years old. Henry left. He took no financial responsibility with him. Lady Blanche, a known gambler whose habit had already eaten significantly into whatever financial cushion she had, was left with 4 children, no income to speak of, and a reputation that made the social world she belonged to considerably less welcoming than it had once been. What followed was a childhood defined by instability. Lady Blanche moved the children from one set of furnished rooms to the next, staying just ahead of creditors, relocating every few months, never settling. Clementine never had quite enough to eat. She helped with the housework from an early age. The security and constancy she craved as a child was simply not available to her, and people who knew her well in adulthood, including her own daughter Mary, traced much of her lifelong anxiety and difficulty with trust directly back to those years. Henry Hosier, who had otherwise shown very little interest in the children, made one remarkable attempt to reassert himself. When Clementine was a teenager living in Dieppe with her mother, Henry appeared and, over lunch, announced his intention to take her back to England to live with his sister, a woman known for using physical punishment as a disciplinary tool. Clementine, who had spent years being described by her mother as plain and uninteresting, discovered in that moment a composure she hadn't known she possessed. She told him quietly, but without hesitation, that her mother would not permit it. And then she left. There was also the matter of Kitty, Clementine's elder sister, the one their mother had always openly preferred, contracted typhoid fever in 1900 while the family was living in Dieppe. Lady Blanche sent Clementine and the younger sister Nellie to Scotland so she could nurse Kitty without distraction. Kitty died at 16. Clementine and Nellie had been sent away before they knew how serious things were and never got to say goodbye. Clementine was 15 years old and had just lost the person she had spent most of her childhood quietly standing behind. She returned to England, enrolled in school at Berkhamsted in Hertfordshire, and discovered that she was rather good at things when someone gave her the space and the structure to try. Her headmistress, Beatrice Harris, recognized something in her that her mother had consistently failed to see: a quality of mind and a seriousness of purpose that distinguished her from many of the girls in her year. Harris encouraged her to consider university, which was still a relatively unusual path for women of her class and era. Blanche had different ideas about what Clementine's future should look like, and the expectation of a suitable marriage took precedence over the expectation of a degree. Clementine went instead to the Sorbonne in Paris, where she studied with the kind of dedication that comes from someone who has understood early that education is not an ornament but a tool. She became fluent in French and German. She read widely. She was, by the time she was in her early 20s, a person of genuine intellectual substance, someone who had built herself from materials that the circumstances of her birth had not provided, and who had done it largely through her own effort. The social world she re-entered on returning to England was one that valued her beauty more readily than it valued anything else about her. She received proposals. She became engaged and then disengaged, twice to the same man, Sidney Peel, and at least once more before the summer of 1908. Each broken engagement carried its own social awkwardness in a world where engagements were not supposed to be reversed. She was giving French lessons for money to help keep herself and her mother afloat. She was 22, independent-minded, increasingly clear about what she did and didn't want, and increasingly uncertain about whether the version of marriage that her world was offering her was going to be one she could actually live in. And then, on an evening in the spring of 1908, she reluctantly attended a dinner party she had nearly turned down, and found herself seated next to a man she had briefly met 4 years earlier, who had stared at her in silence at a ball and left no particular impression. This time things went very differently. Part 2. The Marriage. What it looked like, and what it cost. Winston Churchill was 10 years older than Clementine when they sat beside each other at dinner in 1908. He was already a considerable figure, a veteran of military campaigns in Cuba, India, and South Africa, a published author, a member of Parliament who had crossed the floor from the Conservatives to the Liberals and back again with the confident opportunism that would define his political life. He was also, by the accounts of everyone who knew him well, an extraordinarily demanding human being, restless, voracious in his appetites, capable of enormous warmth, and equally capable of consuming the people around him without quite noticing. The dinner conversation that evening went on for a long time. They connected with a directness and an intellectual energy that surprised them both. Letters followed. Winston proposed in August 1908 at Blenheim Palace, the Churchill ancestral home, during a rainstorm in a small Greek temple in the gardens. Clementine accepted. On September 12, 1908, they married at St. Margaret's Church, Westminster. Winston would later write that his marriage was the most fortunate event of his life. He was not wrong. What he was less careful to acknowledge, at least in public, was what the marriage required of the person who was not him. The early years carried a particular kind of pressure. Winston's political career was already consuming. He was a man who worked at the pace and scale of several ordinary people, who stayed up through the night, dictating to secretaries, who filled rooms with his presence and left them feeling emptied when he departed. Clementine managed the household, the social engagements, the children, and the budget, all while supporting a husband who spent money with a confidence that bore no relation to what was actually in the account. The home they created, first in London and then at Chartwell, the country house in Kent that Winston purchased in 1922, and spent decades and enormous sums renovating and expanding, was a place that required constant management. Chartwell, in particular, was a house that Winston loved with something close to a passion. He painted in its gardens, he built walls on its grounds. He looked at the view across the Weald of Kent and drew from it a kind of peace that he found difficult to locate anywhere else. Clementine found Chartwell considerably more demanding. It was expensive to run, chronically understaffed, given the level at which Winston wished to live, and situated at a remove from London that she found inconvenient. She suggested selling it at various points. Winston would not hear of it. Chartwell was one of the recurring negotiations of the marriage, and it was one that Clementine consistently lost. She was also becoming aware, in those early years, that the marriage she had entered was not one that would offer her much in the way of conventional domestic comfort. Winston was not a partner in the household sense. He was a force of nature that passed through the household, leaving enormous energy and considerable disruption in his wake, and she was the person responsible for managing both. Money was a persistent source of strain. Winston's spending was extravagant by any standard, on staff, on Chartwell, on the lifestyle of a man who considered comfort not a luxury, but a basic requirement of his functioning. Clementine was more cautious by temperament and by the training of a childhood lived on the edge of not having enough. The arguments about spending were real and recurring. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, but consistent with the general picture, of Clementine flinging a plate of spinach at Winston during one particularly heated dinner argument about money. Whether or not the spinach was literal, the frustration it represents was entirely genuine. She also had views of her own, on politics, on social policy, on the way the world ought to be organized. Clementine was, throughout her life, considerably more liberal in her instincts than Winston. She supported causes he found irritating or beside the point. She had been sympathetic to the suffrage movement at a time when Winston publicly opposed votes for women, a position that put the two of them in direct and uncomfortable contradiction on an issue that mattered to her deeply. She worked quietly, over years, to shift his thinking, and there is evidence that she succeeded to a degree that he would not necessarily have acknowledged publicly. She also pushed back on his more extreme positions during the war, on the treatment of Indian independence movements, on certain aspects of colonial policy, and she did it not with deference, but with the directness that the strength of their private relationship made possible. She pushed back on him, not in public, but in private, in letters, in the direct and unsparing way that very few people in his life were willing to address him. Winston told Franklin Roosevelt during the Second World War that he told Clemmy everything. He meant it as a testament to his trust in her. What it also meant was that she was the one person who could and did tell him when he was wrong, and she was right often enough that he listened. She once sent him a letter during the Second World War, one of the most significant private communications of his career, warning him that his manner toward his staff was becoming so domineering that the people around him were losing the courage to tell him unpleasant truths. It was a letter that required both nerve and love to write. Winston received it and pulled back. The relationship between them, at its best, was that kind of thing. Two people who trusted each other enough to be honest in ways that the enormous gap in their public standing would have made impossible with almost anyone else. But the marriage was not always at its best. The time they spent apart was extraordinary. One estimate, given by Clementine's daughter-in-law, suggests the two may have spent as much as 80% of their married life physically separated, partly because of Winston's career obligations, partly because of Clementine's recurring need to retreat from a life that was, by any honest accounting, more than one person could be expected to sustain indefinitely without breaking. The children were among the most painful dimensions of the marriage, 5 of them, and across 4 of those 5 lives, a pattern of suffering and difficulty that raises questions about what the parents were and weren't able to give. And Marigold, the one who didn't survive to adulthood, left a wound that neither Winston nor Clementine ever fully found words for. Part 3. The Children and the Cost of an Absent Presence. Clementine Churchill carried 5 children into the world between 1909 and 1922. The experience of raising them, or more accurately, of not quite managing to raise them in the way that the children needed, is one of the most difficult chapters of her life, and one that she herself acknowledged with more honesty in her later years than the public version of the Churchill story often allows. Diana arrived in 1909, and almost immediately after the birth, something broke in Clementine in a way that she couldn't manage alone. She suffered what would now be recognized as a severe episode of postpartum depression, in the language of the time, a nervous breakdown, and she fled to a cottage near Brighton, leaving the newborn Diana in the care of a nanny. It was not abandonment in the literal sense. It was the response of someone whose mental and emotional resources had reached a point of genuine crisis in an era that offered almost no language for what she was experiencing and no help beyond the suggestion to rest. Diana grew up to feel the distance. She struggled throughout her adult life with depression and unstable relationships. She married Duncan Sandys in 1935, had 3 children, and divorced him in 1960. In October 1963, at the age of 54, Diana died in her London flat by a self-administered overdose. She had been suffering for years, in the quiet way that people who are very private about their pain can suffer, visibly struggling to the people closest to her, invisible to everyone else. Clementine, who was 78 years old at the time, was devastated. Diana's death was the wound that came from a direction she had spent decades trying not to look directly at. Randolph, the only son, had been the focus of his father's ambitions, and something closer to the focus of his mother's frustrated concern. Winston poured enormous energy and expectation into Randolph, wanting him to be his political successor, indulging him in ways that Clementine found troubling from the time Randolph was a boy. The headmaster at his prep school, Sandroyd, reported early on that Randolph was combative. By 15, reports from his schools described him as idle and difficult. Clementine's own view of her son, at least in the accounts that survive, was cooler than Winston's. She saw what the indulgence was doing, and she said so, and her warnings were not heeded. Randolph grew into a difficult adult, brilliant in flashes, combative by nature, chronically alcoholic, and constitutionally unable to sustain either the relationships or the professional achievements that his early promise had suggested might be possible. He had a gift for journalism and a talent for making enemies in approximately equal proportion. He embarrassed his parents repeatedly in the ways that people who have been given too much expectation and too little consistent emotional structure tend to embarrass the people who love them. He did stand for Parliament multiple times, fulfilling his father's hope in form, if not in the sustained and distinguished way Winston had imagined. Randolph died in 1968 at the age of 57. Sarah, the 3rd child, was perhaps the most musically and artistically gifted of the Churchill children. She became an actress, which delighted her and alarmed her parents in roughly equal measure. She married 3 times, the first time without her parents' knowledge, which caused the kind of domestic turbulence that can only occur when a significant secret of that magnitude reaches people who had expected to be consulted. Winston and Clementine eventually found out about the marriage to comedian Vic Oliver through the press, which was not the way they had imagined learning such things. Her adult years were marked by increasing reliance on alcohol and a series of personal losses that she carried visibly. She died in 1982 at the age of 67. And then there was Marigold. Marigold Frances Churchill was born in November 1918, the fourth child, arriving just as the First World War ended. She was, by all accounts, a particularly vivid and charming small person, cheerful, quick, the kind of child whose personality fills a room in a way that makes the room feel its absence keenly. The pet name the family gave her was Duckadilly, which tells you something about the lightness and the affection that surrounded her short life. In August 1921, while staying at a rented house in Broadstairs on the Kent coast, Marigold developed an infection of the throat, septicemia. She deteriorated with the terrifying speed that such infections produced in small children in the years before antibiotics could stop them. She died on August 23rd, 1921. She was 2 years and 9 months old. Winston was not there when she died. He arrived afterward. The story of Clementine in those hours, the sound of her crying, heard through the walls of the house by the adults around her, was reported later by people who were present and who carried the memory of it for the rest of their lives. She was a person of considerable emotional discipline, who had spent years learning to manage herself and others under enormous pressure. The death of Marigold reached somewhere beneath that discipline that nothing had reached before. She and Winston rarely spoke publicly about Marigold after the initial period of grief. This was consistent with the conventions of their time and class, but for Clementine in particular, the silence seems to have been something she wore rather than something she chose. She carried the loss privately for the rest of her life. Mary, the youngest, born in 1922, was the one who navigated her childhood and her adult life with the most stability. She became Lady Soames, lived a long and full life, and wrote the biography of her mother that remains the most authoritative account of Clementine's life. Mary's relative stability is not difficult to account for. By the time she arrived, Clementine had made deliberate adjustments to how the children were raised, and Mary benefited from a measure of consistency and care that the elder children had not always received. Mary died in 2014, the last of the Churchill children, having outlived her siblings by many years. The years of the Second World War brought Clementine to the most publicly visible chapter of her life, but also to a chapter of private strain so significant that even those who knew her well only understood its full weight decades later. Part 4. The War Years: Duty, Distance, and Quiet Collapse. When Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, the world that Clementine had spent over 3 decades helping to build around him moved to an entirely different scale. The demands on him were absolute. The demands on her were absolute in a different way. She was no longer simply the managing partner of a political marriage. She was the closest person to the most consequential figure in the Western world during the most dangerous moment of the 20th century. She took on formal responsibilities of her own during the war. She served as president of the Young Women's Christian Association during the conflict. She chaired the British Red Cross Aid to Russia Fund, raising millions of pounds for Soviet medical supplies. She had been involved with the YMCA during the First World War, organizing canteens for munitions workers, for which she had received a CBE in 1918. Now, in the Second War, she was operating at a level that bore comparison to the work of any senior figure in the national effort. She was not a background presence, she was a participant, but she was also, through all of it, managing Winston. His moods during the war were enormous, the highs when things went well, the collapses into his black dog depression when they didn't. He was not an easy person to live beside at the best of times. At the worst of times, after Dunkirk, after the fall of Singapore, after the setbacks in North Africa. He was carrying a weight that threatened to destabilize him, and Clementine was the person who absorbed the overflow. She wrote him letters. During periods when they were separated, and during the war, those separations were frequent, as Winston traveled to meetings with Roosevelt in Washington, with Stalin in Moscow, with military commanders across the theaters of war. Clementine wrote. She wrote honestly, carefully, and sometimes bravely. The letter she sent him about his treatment of his staff, warning him that his manner was driving away the honest counsel he needed, required her to hold steady against the knowledge of how he might receive it. She wrote that the people closest to him were becoming afraid to bring him bad news, and that this was exactly the condition most dangerous to a leader in wartime. He received the letter, reflected on it, and adjusted. The letter is preserved in the archives. It is one of the most striking documents of their marriage, and one of the most consequential acts of private political advice of the war period. What is less well documented, because it was private in the way that Clementine kept all her most difficult things private, was the condition she was in for significant portions of the war. The strain of Winston's position and personality, the worry about her children scattered by the conflict, the relentless pace of a life that offered no real rest, all of it accumulated over years into something that went beyond ordinary exhaustion. It was during the 1930s, not the war, that the most significant personal crisis of that decade became known. In 1935, during what the sources around her described as a breakdown serious enough to require complete withdrawal from ordinary life, Clementine took a long solo voyage aboard a friend's yacht, the Rosora, belonging to Lord Moyne. She travelled to Borneo, the Celebes, the Moluccas, New Caledonia, islands at an enormous remove from the life she was living in England. She was gone for months. Winston wrote to her often during this time, the letters revealing both his genuine dependence on her and his imperfect understanding of why she had needed to go. She brought back a barley dove, which she kept at Chartwell, and when it died, she buried it in the garden beneath a sundial and had a small verse inscribed on the base about wandering too far from sober men and thinking of the island still. The voyage raised speculation, which has never been conclusively resolved, about whether Clementine had entered into some kind of intimate relationship with Terence Phillip, a wealthy art dealer who travelled with the party and was 7 years younger than she was. Most historians have found the evidence inconclusive, and there were contemporaries who believed Philip's own inclinations lay elsewhere. What is not in doubt is that Clementine needed that distance desperately, and that she took it from Winston, from England, from the life that had been constructed around his needs for so long. She had attempted to take her own life at one point during the 1930s, a moment of profound private crisis that very few people knew about during her lifetime. She later received electroconvulsive therapy in 1963 as part of hospital treatment for serious depression. These are the facts that the public version of Clementine Churchill, the composed, elegant woman beside the great man, almost entirely conceals. After the war ended, the world moved on. Winston remained Winston, still enormous, still consuming, still the kind of presence that organized everyone around him toward his own requirements. And Clementine, who had given so much, was left to find out what remained. Part 5. The Long Aftermath and the Woman Who Survived. Winston Churchill lost the 1945 general election in a result that stunned him and much of the world. Britain, having endured 6 years of the most grueling war in its history under his leadership, voted to give that leadership to someone else. The scale of the defeat was almost incomprehensible to him. He had genuinely not seen it coming, in the way that politicians who have been at the center of history's attention for 5 years sometimes lose their ability to read the quieter signals from the people they are ostensibly serving. Clementine, by several accounts, was not entirely surprised. She had a clearer read of political atmospheres than Winston. It was one of the ways her own political intelligence expressed itself. And she had understood something about the mood of the country that his enormous ego had made it difficult for him to register. The country wanted change, and change meant a different kind of government, and the man who had been indispensable in war was not the same man the country wanted to build a peacetime welfare state. When the result came in, she reportedly told him, with characteristic directness, that the loss might turn out to be a blessing in disguise. He told her, with characteristic wit, that the blessing was very effectively disguised. They returned to private life. Winston painted, wrote his memoirs, a multi-volume account of the Second World War that won him the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953, and maintained the social life of a statesman who understood that the world still wished to observe him even in opposition. He suffered a serious stroke in 1953 that was concealed from the public for months, one of the more remarkable instances of information management in 20th century political history. Clementine was a part of that management, as she had been a part of managing the public face of his career for decades. She continued in her role, even when the role was less about supporting a statesman and more about supporting an aging man who was not always willing to acknowledge what aging was doing to him. Winston served a second term as Prime Minister from 1951 to 1955. He was reluctant to leave. Clementine had reservations about the second term from the beginning. His health was not equal to it, and she knew it better than anyone. She had spent decades attending to the discrepancy between what Winston believed himself capable of and what the evidence around him suggested. During the second term, she watched him struggle in ways that were painful. He finally resigned in April 1955. He spent his final decade at Chartwell and in London, painting, receiving guests, slowly withdrawing from the public world that had defined him. The man who had commanded the attention of nations was becoming an old man in a chair by a window, and Clementine watched that transition with the mixture of grief and relief that comes from being a witness to someone else's long and very loud life coming quietly to its close. She was beside him through all of it. He died on January 24th, 1965, at the age of 90, following a severe stroke 9 days earlier. Clementine sat with him through those final days. She had been married to him for 56 years. The state funeral that followed was one of the largest Britain had ever organized. Heads of government from across the world attended, and millions watched the television broadcast. Clementine stood through it with the composure she had always brought to the public moments of their life together, the grief held inside where it had always lived. When she placed her flowers at his grave at the small church at Blaydon, near Blenheim Palace, she was heard to whisper that she would be with him again soon. She was wrong about the timing. She lived for another 12 years. What those 12 years looked like is something that the public version of Clementine Churchill tends to gloss over with the assumption that widowhood was simply the final chapter. In fact, she was created a life peer in her own right in May 1965, Baroness Spencer Churchill of Chartwell, and she took her seat in the House of Lords. She voted. She had political views that were her own, and she exercised them. She was, in the last decade of her life, finally in a position of formal public standing that had nothing to do with being Winston Churchill's wife. The later years brought their own difficulties. 3 of her 5 children had now died. The financial position she was left in was less secure than people assumed. The costs of running the life that had been built around Winston had not left her with abundance, and in the late 1970s, She quietly sold several of Winston's paintings at auction to maintain her circumstances. Her deafness increased. Her world narrowed. But she was present in it. She went to the theatre. She attended galleries. She saw friends. She had outlived her extraordinary husband and 3 of her children, and a significant number of the crises that had threatened to break her, and she was still there. Clementine Churchill died on December 12, 1977, at her home in Knightsbridge, of a heart attack. She was 92 years old. Part 6. What the life actually was. The version of Clementine Churchill that the world carried for most of the 20th century was a supporting one. The loyal wife, the steady presence, the woman behind the man. It is not that this version is false. It is that it is so incomplete as to be almost a different person. She had grown up in genuine hardship and instability, with no reliable father, a mother who preferred her sister, a childhood spent moving between rented rooms and avoiding creditors. She had built herself from that start into a woman of considerable intelligence, political instinct, and moral conviction who happened to pour most of those qualities into a marriage rather than a career of her own. She said, at various points in her life, that she would have liked to have been a statesman herself if she had been born in different circumstances. Sonia Purnell, who wrote the most comprehensive biography of Clementine's life, reported that Clementine had expressed early in her life a wish to have been born a man so she could have entered public service on her own terms. The people who knew her well believed she meant it and believed she had the capacity for it. Instead, she created the conditions that made Winston Churchill's statesmanship possible. She edited his speeches, not just for grammar, but for tone, for pitch, for the places where his instinct for self-aggrandizement was making the argument weaker rather than stronger. She managed the emotional temperature of the household in which he operated. She kept him honest when his own confidence became a form of blindness. She told him things no one else had the courage to tell him, and she told him at moments when the stakes of his decisions were the highest they had ever been in British history. She did this not because she had no ambitions of her own, but because she had made a choice, early in the marriage, about which vehicle her ambitions would travel in. And she drove that vehicle for 56 years. She did all of this while raising 5 children, 4 of whom struggled profoundly in their adult lives. Not because she was a cold or unloving person, but because the marriage she was in demanded a totality of focus on Winston that left very little for anyone else, including herself. She acknowledged this in her later life with more directness than most people in her position might have managed. She suffered. That is the part the public version leaves out. She suffered from anxiety and depression across decades. She experienced a breakdown after her first child was born. She reached a point of private crisis in the 1930s, serious enough that she left England for months to be alone on the other side of the world. She received hospital treatment for depression in 1963, the same year her eldest daughter died. These are not footnotes to the story of a woman who held everything together. They are the story of a woman who held everything together despite being pulled apart by it. The marriage itself was genuinely loving and genuinely unequal. Winston loved Clementine with the completeness of a man who understood that she was essential to him in ways that went beyond gratitude or partnership. She loved him with the commitment of someone who had invested 56 years of herself in a shared project and believed in what the project was for. That both of those things were true simultaneously, the love and the cost, the devotion and the difficulty, is what makes the story worth telling honestly, rather than simply admiringly. She outlived him by nearly 13 years. She outlived 3 of her 5 children. She sold his paintings to pay her bills in a house in Knightsbridge. She sat in the House of Lords and voted on legislation that she actually cared about, on her own terms, in her own name. She kept going, in the particular way that people who have survived enormous difficulty tend to keep going, not as an act of heroism, but as the only remaining option, and the one they have always been better at than they knew. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.